we have seen so much change in Israel specifically. I mean, just traveling there, as now you do regularly, but if you think about what it was like in 1971, and then your most recent trip, the changes virtually on every level, socially, economically, culturally, the changes have been enormous. And I'm wondering, how have the changes within Israel affected your sense of our connection to Israel and our responsibilities to Israel?
So, I mean, if you go in 1971, you know, it's right after the Six-Day War. It's still a time of huge optimism. Huge optimism. And every soldier you meet is a hero, and you're in awe of every Israeli, and every Israeli turns to you and says, "You're okay, but come live in Israel. Then you can participate in Jewish history." Every Israeli says that. And, you know, so it was just an amazing time. And I think that and of course that had a profound impact on me, but it had a profound impact on all American Jews. It actually had a profound impact on Jews all over the world. I mean, Soviet Jews didn't know who they were until after the '67 war, and we really didn't know who we were until after the '67 war. I think that we were part of an America that was highly assimilationist. And it wasn't like we hated being Jewish, but it wasn't exactly like, you know, when I walked down the streets of Washington Heights and I had a kippah on my head, and someone called me a dirty yellow Jew, well, you know, I was too fat to run, and I was too weak to fight, so you just kind of put your head down. And by the way, in 1956, you didn't call the ADL when someone called you a dirty yellow Jew. Either you hit him in the head or you walked away, or, I mean, it was a different America. It was just a radically different America. And after 1967, they might have called you a dirty Jew, but they never called you a dirty yellow Jew again. Never. Never. Because we had the strongest army in the world, and we were the bravest fighters in the world. And so, and also in the late 60s, of course, there was another profound change, which was the Black Power movement, which gave all Americans the right to be whoever they were and to be proud of whoever they were. And I think it's, if you think about change and how human life changes, the difference between 1964 and 1968 was gigantic. I mean, in 1964, you hardly knew where Vietnam was. Civil rights was maybe an abstract thought in somebody's mind. Black power couldn't be imagined. Gay rights was unimaginable. So much changed between 1964 and 1968. So the whole power of Jewish life in America from '67 until 1990 was all about Israel. It was all about, you know, Jonathan Wucher called it the era of sacred survival, the civil religion of American Jews. That the most important day of the year wasn't Yom Kippur, it was the day you went down to Washington to lobby on behalf of Israel with AIPAC. And that wasn't just the federations or AIPAC, the synagogues too. I mean, it was what everybody talked about. It was hugely important to us because we recognized that our very survival sort of depended on this place. So we worshipped Israel. We built Holocaust museums. We did, you know, we did all of that. And then in 1990, we found out that notwithstanding that sacred survival was our goal, that we weren't going to survive as Jews because our children didn't know they were Jewish anymore. They didn't even care about Israel anymore, notwithstanding that that's all we talked about, because we had failed to give them, you know, any kind of Jewish education. So there was just a huge change. So I would say, I thought that the main challenge of American Jewish life was going to be to strengthen Jewish education, to reclaim a generation, and through that, to reclaim our sense of connection to Israel. What's actually amazing now is that that was wrong, see? What was amazing is that that was wrong, and Birthright shows how wrong that was. In other words, all of a sudden, now that we have the opportunity to send 40,000 kids a year to Israel, I mean, that's half a generation. That's unimaginable. I mean, that was everybody's dream, but nobody ever thought, I mean, I was writing about this in the mid-'70s about sending all of our kids to Israel, but who could imagine how it could be done? That's why we created the Passport to Israel program, you know, through which we try to send high school kids to Israel. But who would have thought that you could get the majority of kids to go to Israel? And the impact when they come back is almost unbelievable. You know, it actually has the potential. And this is not just, these are kids who were from in-married families, intermarried families, kids who never even thought about being Jewish before, and all of a sudden we have the opportunity to reclaim a generation. So Israel, amazingly, is actually just as important as it's ever been. The question is whether, for us as an identity, I mean, survival of Israel, its importance for Jewish history, its importance because of our relationship with the Israelis, all that stuff is beyond question. But the idea that it's still a powerful force in the development of our kids' Jewish identity wasn't quite as clear. Now it's quite clear again. If we don't blow this opportunity, which we probably will, then we can really, I think we're going to have an amazing Jewish future. So Israel, you know, goes from being absolutely the center point of our life to perhaps not the center point of our life and back to being the center point of our life again. But at the same time, we can't forget that during the first period when it was the center point in our life, we kind of blew it by forgetting about that there's more to Jewish life than just Israel. There's spirituality and learning and a 3,500-year-old culture and all of those things. In terms of supporting Israel, I mean, there was a time when it was just a question of, you know, feeding people or giving them basic stuff during the '67 war, or even during the recent, you know, Lebanon war when there were missiles falling on Haifa, our sister city. So you went just to be with them because that's where you were supposed to be when your brothers and sisters, you know, are in trouble. But now I think that for a lot of people, and for me included, the most important thing that you can do for Israel right now is actually, first of all, to create real relationships, because our children and grandchildren and their children and grandchildren have to have something in common, or we're going to lose everything. And second of all, is to be able to defend Israel against outrageous attacks in you know, everything from the UN to the media to everything else. I mean, outrageous attacks. And since right now Israel has like one friend in the whole world, the United States of America, if we don't want to lose Israel, then we better be prepared to defend Israel. Because the last thing in the world that we can allow to happen is for Israel to lose its critical alliance with the United States. You know, AIPAC's been fantastic. AIPAC is a great thing to give resources to because it's done an unbelievable job for us. But you know, at some point, if some president of the United States ever, God forbid, gets up and says, you know, Israel's a burden, not a friend, then it's going to deteriorate fast. And, you know, we've been fortunate to have politicians who've always been supportive of Israel, and I know that's going to continue, but just have to be alert.
I'm wondering, with the change in our relationship with Israel, where it used to really be this notion that the money we sent was most immediately necessary, truly for survival, for various social programs, and how, at least for a time, as the economy in Israel has improved, that it seemed the best thing we could send was our children in terms of the relationship. And in fact, I think it was Yossi Balin who suggested that Israel actually paid to bring American kids over because they felt it was so important.
Right. Israel put serious money into birthright, like $30 million a year of their money, their taxpayer money, to bring our kids to Israel. So it's
right, and I think very few people know that, and it's an important part of the whole picture to know. I mean, when I was in Israel this past summer, every other bus, just the bus companies alone, depend on this. I've never seen so many tug-lead buses in my every second or third bus was carrying, and not just American kids. When we were there were Argentine college students and French college students. So it's extraordinary. I was wondering though.